Hi, everybody. My name's Arwyn.
And I'm Dylan.
And we
Allegedly.
are Bar Club, a writing group that meets in Portland, Maine. And we come to you with videos about writing.
Live, every time, off the top, improvised. No better content anywhere globally, I'm willing to say. Just as a fact. So
this week we're talking about world building. And kind of some implicit rules in world building. I can't say that phrase very well, we're gonna stumble. But
it's gonna be good.
I do build worlds. So here we go. So have you ever read a book where there's dragons in it, but then something doesn't make sense, it annoys you?
Right, like they're in New Jersey and there's like a dragon randomly.
Well, that would be fine.
That would actually be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Trademark, don't steal it.
Or more like there's that one detail that doesn't like work within the world and then it bothers you. Even though there's dragons and dragons don't exist, but for whatever reason,
it's
this
like,
detail.
It's about continuity, right? It's about having the world be consistent that you're presenting. So like I have read books like that where there's like one thing that sticks out. I'm like, this doesn't really seem to fit or like jive with my impression of the worldview.
Yeah.
Whether it's, the setting being weird or just the way that the people acted or like people acting, an organization having different values or something than were earlier, previously established. I think it can be any number of very small things, which is why I think thinking about world building as a discrete process separate from your other narrative building is important.
Developing the rules for the world and having people match those rules.
Right, yeah, exactly.
So I'm thinking about, and I'm going to pick on The Handmaid's Tale a little bit. Sorry if you guys like that. I love the first season. The second season, what broke me out of that world was they had built a very consistent world that made sense. Granted, it was nothing like our world, supposedly. But then in the second season, they started breaking their own rules. And that's when I was like, wait a second, I can't buy into this anymore.
Right.
So like a whole premise of like the first season was that they at all costs would keep women alive who had like viable uteri.
Right.
Is that uteri? Uteruses? I don't know what the plural for that is. But anyways, I'm a writer, right? And so that was like a reason why particular characters survived season 1 was because under any circumstances, if there's a chance they could be like surrogate parents or whatever the word is, they would be kept alive. But then in the second season, they kill the 15-year-old. Sorry, spoiler alert. It's been out long enough where it's like, if you haven't watched it, I'm sorry. Well, spoiler alert. And that made no sense to me. Like that because that rule was broken, I was like, I can't buy into this narrative anymore. Because it's like,
because it undermines everything that you saw and that you allowed up to that point.
Exactly. They like built this world and the world had rules and the characters followed consistently within those rules.
Yeah.
And when the rules weren't followed, I couldn't believe it. Like it was just like like my suspension of disbelief was ruined. I was just sitting there being like, this makes no sense. And they didn't give like a reason why that rule was broken. So like in your world, you can break rules, but you have to address the fact you've broken the rules.
Right. Yeah.
So even if you have like a fantasy where there's dragons and whatever, you have to follow your own rules. And you have to figure out what those rules are.
Yeah.
And if you are breaking those rules, like you have to address that you're breaking the rules. Or else the reader's going to be like, what?
Well, then they have no reason to have buy-in to the rest of it. Because it seems like at that point you were just kind of being fast and loose with the narrative and with the characters because, and at that point they probably imagine that you're bending things to your will for narrative expediency.
As a plot device.
Yeah, exactly. It's
which is awful.
Yeah, which it represents...
Visible plot devices.
Yeah, exactly. It's
like, no good.
It's because you didn't spend enough time to actually develop like the parameters and the rules. It's like if you look at any of the Tolkien books, any of those, like part of the reason why it's such a rich, cohesive universe is because there is so much lore and backstories built into the hierarchy and the way that the societies function, and even just like who is more powerful than these people. It's not like Frodo can run up and like shank Sauron in the face because that would be really inconsistent with the established sort of power structure and hierarchy of Middle-earth. So,
and he did I'm granted I have not fully read Lord of the Rings, I'm sorry. Anyways.
No, obviously.
But he did a really good job of making those rules clear. So that's part of it too, is that when you're writing, you kind of have to build the world and like educate your reader.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to do that without, like, a bunch of exposition.
Well, that's the thing is, like...
another thing you want to avoid.
Maybe Tolkien is a bad example, because he has, like, basically a whole book of exposition. Just, like, here's, like, the footnotes for the whole trilogy and The Hobbit and whatever. It's, like, read this whole thing so you can actually understand what's going on.
And I will say The Handmaid's Tale, the book, did a really good job of world building without a lot of exposition. So if you are really jonesing for a good example, that's one. Don't watch the show, though. They didn't do that.
But yeah, what are some other examples that you have thought did a good job without having that block of exposition?
Yeah. I'm been put on the spot. But I know, like, one method is you could have, like, the knowledgeable character interacting with the protagonist who's not knowledgeable. I feel like that is overdone a lot, but it's a thing you can do. You can do that, where there's, like, the naive protagonist and then the, like, educated, not naive character who, like, comes in.
Wise old man.
Yeah, like Gandalf or Dumbledore. Yeah, Lord of the Rings. We're just, like, tying it all back. Yeah, and I think the main thing is that you have to stick to your rules. You have to figure out what those rules are. You have to stick to them. You have to make them consistent, and then you have to explain any deviation. That's like the one sentence takeaway from this whole video.
One, I think, genre that does world building very well, and if you get good examples of it, can be a good sort of manual on how to do this, is cyberpunk stuff. So I feel like
your cyberpunk.
And part of the reason I like it is because a lot of the world building is very, very detailed, extremely explicit, like down to the brand names of products that the characters are using, and everything is sort of branded. That's sort of like the aesthetic where everything's like hyper branded. Mm-hmm. But that, I think, does a really good job of pulling you in to the story and to the world, I should say. So it's like, one, I remember Neuromancer by William Gibson is probably like the definitive cyberpunk book. But some of the exposition of that, he sort of writes around things almost, where he'll be describing an action, but he'll be describing it indirectly through the scenery and through what's happening. And one technique that he did that I thought was interesting is he used like a newscast or like an informational video for kids that this character was like sort of hearing at the side of their head to explain one of the fundamental technological underpinnings of the story, which was this idea of the Matrix. So you go in and you're reading this book and you kind of need to know technically what the Matrix, like what the parameters of this are. How does someone interact with this? What are the limits of this? What, how does one jack into it, essentially? Yeah. And without doing those things, he didn't say, Case sat down and plugged in his thing. He said, no, he took out his branded board and he walks you through it sort of sequentially, but he has enough in the beginning where he overhears part of this children's show where you get, okay, here are like the fundamentals of
that's really
what you need to know going forward. Yeah. I thought it stuck with me because I thought it was a very sort of deft way of doing it, and it was in universe was a nice thing. So I never, I recognized what he was doing, but it was seamless that it didn't take me out. I was like, this is a very plausible way that someone could learn something. Yeah. And it didn't, it's not like there's a guy who knows all about the Matrix is going down to rent a book at the library, and then here's part of the book. No, it's like he's just overhearing. He already knows, but this is adding to the ambiance of the scene while also informing the readers. So I thought that was a very cohesive way of doing it. I thought that was a good example of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to read that now.
It's good. It has some of the most detailed world building I think I've ever seen, and sometimes, obviously, there are cyberpunk books that are not nearly as tight narratively, but I do think that even ones that have, they're less sophisticated or just less good overall, do a good job of crafting a very, very detailed world. Yeah. That you can sort of bring yourself into. And I think that's a huge asset that if you're going to be writing something, it would be good to sit down and think about just atmospherically, what is it like to be in this world that I'm creating? Like, what does it feel like? What colors, what smells, like, what is it like if you're sitting in a room in your character's house, at any time of the day? It's like, I feel like you should be able to feel that. Yeah. And then that will allow you to get a template to then, lay out the rest of the world that you can remain consistent with going forward.
No, that's true. That's true. And your reader doesn't always have to know everything you know about your world.
No, definitely not.
Kind of the same to the characters. It's often good to actually be the one that's most informed and not have, you don't have to reveal everything, but it's good for you to know. Yeah.
That's just going to add to the richness, because I think that's going to come out naturally in your writing. If you are writing from a place of, that's well-researched, or where you have a huge core knowledge that you're sort of writing from, I think that's going to do a lot to just implicitly imbue your stuff with that kind of richness. So.
Yeah, and I think also one thing I want to address before we close up is if you're using myths as a world, or if you're incorporating like any sort of like folklore, mythology, if you break the rules of that like mythos, you have to explain yourself.
Right.
You know, like in God, what's it called? A Court of Thorn and Roses, the S.J. Moss books. The Fae can lie, but they had to explain that they lied to humans saying they couldn't lie, right? So they had to like kind of like have a moment of like, oh, these people need to be able to lie, so I need to like break the mythology of the Fae, which is that they can't lie.
Gotcha.
That's like a thing. And then explain it, because if you have, you know, like a type of creature or a fairy tale that you're retelling or whatever, like if you are breaking rules, like you have to kind of explain that to your reader, because they have all of this like, you know, background in their head of like what the myth already is. You know, like vampires, you know, exploding in the sun. Unless you're in Twilight, which she didn't do a good job explaining why that happens.
That's
Anyways, she just was like, actually, this is a thing. They sparkle. But in other stories where you need the vampire to be able to not like die in the sun, they have to like explain. Either it's like, oh, only newbies die in the sun. I've seen that before. But like older ones don't, or like they're just sensitive. Blah blah blah.
Losers.
And so like so if you're taking like creatures or like mythology or fairy tales or whatever, established parts of culture, you have to like explain yourself if you break it. And it's totally fine to break it. I love it when people totally mess with things. Like as much as like I was not like a giant fan of ACOTAR, I really liked that she broke a lot of like the Fae mythology. But anyways, so that is my little tidbit too about world building.
And if you don't do it, you gotta be consistent. If you're not consistent, I will literally throw your book in the garbage and light it on fire. So
don't listen to him.
Just think about
He's like
that.
the worst.
Think about that.
He's my editor. Don't you feel bad for me? I feel like you should feel bad for me.
Absolutely. Thank you for tuning in. Let us know if you have any thoughts, questions, topics you'd like us to cover, things that you hate about us. Please don't say that.
Don't say that.
I'm very
too sensitive.
I'm like a vampire, some might say. Very sensitive.
Yeah, on that note,
Thank you for
have
tuning
a
in.
good week. Bye.